we have here a very important guest list. Very important guest list. Because the names on this list, and only the names on this list, are invited to a very special social event. We'll talk a little bit more about our guest list here. First, in our gospel tonight, Jesus has been invited to the home of one of the religious leaders. And he gives them a lesson, those invited, when he sees how people were maneuvering and jockeying around, trying to get to the highest place at the table, most important place. And he says to them, when you're invited, go, take the lowest place. Then the host may come to you and say, come to a higher place. And then you will enjoy the respect and the admiration of everybody there. You will be noticed. Now, at first it sounds like Jesus is giving us a lesson on how to look good, how to get ahead, how to score points over other people. But he very quickly changes that when he says, he who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. What he's really doing is giving a lesson about who is important in God's kingdom. Who's important in God's kingdom? And he makes a couple of points right off. He says, in God's kingdom, we're lucky to even be invited to the table of God. Let's face it, for most of us, we're lucky to even make it in there. And we should remember that. And secondly, he says that in God's kingdom, at God's table, it's God that's going to decide who deserves the place of honor. Just like the host of the banquet. That was his decision to make. And God will make the decision in his kingdom. Well, then he goes right on to give the host a lesson on what the guest list should look like. Remember our guest list here. What should the guest list look like? He said, when you hold a lunch or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they invite you back and you will receive your payment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. That's when you'll be repaid. Now notice that the proud and the powerful don't appear on God's guest list, do they? But who is on that guest list? Well, it's the poor, because they're hungry and need food. It's the outcasts of society because they need acceptance and welcome, which they don't get. It's the sick who need just a few moments of joy in the midst of their suffering. These are the ones invited. Now notice, it's only at the very end, the very last sentence, does Jesus tell us about our reward for showing hospitality to those who can't return the favor. Quite simply says, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. You will receive your reward for showing kindness to those in need. And we also want to remember again now that when it comes to God's kingdom, it's God that's going to decide who gets the places of honor, who is rewarded. Maybe an example will help. St. Lawrence was a deacon in charge of helping all the poor and the needy in the city of Rome about 250 years after the birth of Christ. Well, the great persecution started and came over the church, and the Pope and many religious leaders were put to death. Now, the governor of the city was a very greedy pagan, and he, for some reason, got it into his head that the church was hiding an enormous fortune, and he wanted that money. So he said to Lawrence, "Bring me the treasure of the church." Well, Lawrence said, "Well, look, this is a big job here. This is going to take me some time. I'm going to need at least 3 days to get you all the treasure of the church." Well, the governor said, "Well, okay, that's okay. But in 3 days, I better have that money." Well, Lawrence got busy, and he went all over the city, and he gathered together all the poor and the needy that were supported by the church. And he gathered them together finally in one big church. And then he invited the governor. He came to the church and opened the doors of the church, looked in, and said, "Behold, the treasure of the church. This is the treasure of the church." Well, as we can imagine, the governor was enraged and put Lawrence to a long, slow, and agonizing death. Lawrence knew what God's guest list should look like. Now, back to our own guest list here. Remember our guest list that we're talking about. This is so important because this is a list of the names of the men who live at the Oxford Inn night shelter, not far from here. The homeless men living at the Oxford Inn shelter. Now the names on this list, the men listed here, are invited every Wednesday morning to a breakfast in our parish center. They're hungry and need the food. But it's even more important, it seems, that they need the welcome and the acceptance, the hospitality, because they so seldom get it. And the good news for us is that each one of us here, everybody here tonight, by our donations to the collection, make this meal possible. In a certain sense, we are the host of that special meal, each one of us. And we can rejoice in that, because remember the promise of our reward for helping those who can't return the favor. What Jesus was really telling the host in the story, and most important, telling each one of us here tonight, is that we need to change our hearts. We need to change our hearts. And that means opening our hearts. Opening our hearts to give of ourselves to those around us in need, particularly those that can't return the favor. And the needs are all around us, aren't they? Huh? I'm sure everybody in the church tonight knows at least someone who is sick. Somebody who would be greatly helped if we just sent a card or gave a phone call, or best of all, a visit to that person who obviously can't return the favor right now. And when our friends, our co-workers, and even our family keep going on and complaining about how our tax dollars are wasted on those who can't help themselves, we don't have to join in the chorus and agree all the time. You see, giving of ourselves can be very difficult, can it? Huh? I find it difficult because it's something that, well, really all of us have to do every day. Seems though we're always starting over again. Looking at ourselves another day and just asking ourselves, no, wait a minute. Is my heart really open? Am I willing to give of myself to those that can't return the favor? It's a tough thing to do. So, as we go along now and prepare ourselves to share in the body and blood of Christ, let's make it a point to ask our God for the help and the strength that we need to give of ourselves to those who can't return the favor.